If we want them tortured, we send them to Syria. People were being executed at the rate of 40 to 50 a day. We are able to go back home, and we're all going home.
They see Russia as a bulwark against America's hegemony. What differentiates this current opposition and ISIS as a group? The Syrian revolution began in 2011 as a grassroots civil society uprising against one of the most tyrannical rulers in the Muslim world. Bashar al-Assad, like his father before him, presided over a state of terror with disappearances, secret police repression, and a punitive state machinery that governed through fear. Assad styled himself as an anti-imperialist, when in reality, he had colluded with the West in past conflicts. And after 9/11, Syria became a favored place for the Americans to render suspects for horrific torture. But because of the nature of social media, a narrative has taken hold that disparages the Syrian opposition. Today, we want to address some of these accusations. Now, today we have Moazzam Begg, who is the senior director of CAGE, the author of the book Enemy Combatant, a book about his time as a detainee, first in Bagram and then in Guantanamo Bay's detention facility. He also spent time in Syria during the revolution as part of his investigation into the Assad regime's complicity in the CIA torture program. Moazzam Begg, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to the Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and thank you for having me again.
Jazakallah khair. Well, look, we've got a number of, I suppose, accusations or criticisms that are made of the Syrian opposition. And I think it's fair to say that some of these narratives have now sort of taken hold in some quarters on the internet and beyond. And I just want to really tap into your vast experience of conflicts, but also of Syria, to allow us to appreciate where we are in terms of the current Syrian opposition. Now, of course, alhamdulillah, and it is a good thing, it's a very positive thing. We now have the opposition sweeping across the country. And at the time of filming, Assad still barely remains in power. We don't know where he'll be when this actually goes live. But I suppose the first question to ask is really about Assad himself. Assad styles himself as an anti-imperialist, someone who's worked against the United States and against her interests for his entire governmental career. Is that how you see Assad?
Let me just quote a former CIA operative who talks about the relationship between the CIA and the various Arab regimes with which they worked. And so he says, Robert Baer, that if we wanted, the CIA, wanted an interrogation, a robust interrogation, we send them to Jordan. And if we want them tortured, we send them to Syria. And if we want them disappeared completely, you will never see them again, we send them to Egypt. Now, part of my role since my return from Guantanamo has been not just to look at Guantanamo, but at the renditions program and the outsourcing of the torture program. So we know that individuals were sent to Egypt, to Libya, to Morocco, and other places because they would do in their countries things that even the Americans wouldn't do. So we call this the outsourcing of the torture program. But one place that people were sent to for the torture, and the most frightening of those places, was Syria. And I know this personally because in Bagram, the United States CIA agents used to threaten me, Moazzam, or 558, which is my number, if you don't cooperate, we will send you to either Syria or Egypt, meaning that you're either going to get tortured or you're going to get disappeared. So being this great anti-imperialist bulwark, I mean, let's check it. Let's put that to the test. So if you look at the cases of Maher Arar, Abdullah al-Maliki, Ahmed Abul Mu'ati, and Muayyid Nuruddin, these are all Syrian Canadians who at one time or another, from 2002 and onwards, were sent with complicity of the United States of America and the Canadian government to Syria. And Maher Arar, for example, talks about how he was sent to a place called Farah, Palestine, which is Palestine branch, which is known to be an intelligence headquarters torture center for the Syrian Mukhabarat. And there he was put in a coffin-like cell and remained for around 10 months before he was eventually sent back. The Canadian government, in his case, in the case of all the others I've mentioned, eventually, after years of litigation, apologized and paid them millions of dollars in compensation because they understood the level at which these people had been tortured. At Cage, we still are looking for individuals who've been, and so you understand how this has happened. The war on terror happens. The United States invades Afghanistan. It has people like me sent through the Pakistani government, capturing us from our homes, to Guantanamo. There are people like Abu Khalid al-Suri, like Mustafa Set Mariam Nasser, and others who are grabbed by the CIA and handed over where? To Guantanamo? No, to the Assad regime, where they remain in prison for years on end. In fact, one of the reasons why I, as you said, I went to Syria during the revolution wasn't to meet with individuals who'd been part of that rendition program.
Right.
And I did meet some, including Abu Khalid, who, of course, became a leader of one of the other groups, Ahrar al-Sham. But the point was that this network of the rendition program, I met one Libyan guy who had been sent from Syria to Libya to be tortured because the information was given by British intelligence. MI5 intercepted a conversation that he had with somebody in Britain, and they gave that information to the Assad regime. So there was the British were working alongside, at least in some matters, with the Assad regime. And there's several others. We've come across the case of Mohammed Zamar, who was renditioned from Germany to Syria and tortured there. So there are several nationals of the West who are originally Syrians, but nonetheless Western nationals, that have been working alongside, have been tortured because their governments have been working alongside Syria in the war on terror.
So let me get this straight. It's not just that they're being sent to Syria, but there is active collusion. There was active collusion between the Syrian security forces and the security forces in, say, America or Britain, where information was being relayed as a result of this torture campaign.
Yeah, so we understand this. It's intelligence cooperation, because after the war on terror, and it's really it's important we understand this. Why is the so-called part of what's apparently part of the axis of evil, a state sponsor of terrorism, at least according to the United States of America, meaning Syria? How come they're working with intelligence services of the West, which is undeniable? And the answer is, of course, we may dislike you, but these people we dislike even more. And that means essentially any quote-unquote Islamists or people who want Islamic solutions for the future of their countries.
Right. We have seen over the last few days amazing, spectacular scenes of prisoners being released. Some prisoners being in Hama, for example, have been in prison for 40 years since the uprising in the 1980s. What do you think these people have gone through?
Well, here's an example. There's a lady, her name is Hiba Dabbagh, and she wrote a book called Just 5 Minutes. And she was in 1982, 18 years old, when the Mukhabarat came to knock on her door. They'd already taken her father and her brothers, and eventually they were killed. She and then her mother were taken into custody, and those 5 minutes turned into 9 years. And they are 9 years of, it's a hard book she's written called Just 5 Minutes. And when you read it, you come across all of the cases, how she describes the torture, the sexual violence, the rape, the beatings and the murder. And not just the people from the Muslim Brotherhood, of which she's accused of being connected to, but people from other different groups, including dissident Alawites, including leftists and so forth. So everybody's non-Baathists who are not part of the regime's own version of Arab nationalism are being killed and tortured for decades. I want to tell you a little story of a man I met. His name is Abu Ahmed. And I met him in Idlib when I was living there. He'd lost one eye because it had been poked out by the Hafiz al-Assad's soldiers when they took him into custody.
He's the father of Bashar al-Assad.
Yes, Hafiz al-Assad is the father, yes. So Abu Ahmed was a teacher of the Quran, And like many others, thousands of people were captured and taken into prison. And this prison was called Tadmor, which is on the border with Iraq. And Tadmor is as being even recently described as a terrible torture center. And in Tadmor, people were being executed. He told me there was at the rate of 40 to 50 a day. They were put in large numbers of people in small prison cells. Each person was allocated a number, and the guards didn't know which number belonged to which name. When his number was called, he told me this himself, and it sends shockwaves down your spine. And he said that when my number was called, I was either lying down or asleep. And one of my students, who I didn't know, he went in my place and he was executed. And that's how I'm still alive. And so you imagine him, that's his experience. The most conservative estimates say 25,000 people were killed, and at most 40,000 people were killed. If you ask people today, do you know about the Hama massacre? Most people have never heard of it. Yeah. Yet it happened in 1982. And the backdrop of that is so important because Hama has now just fallen to the rebels. And this lady, Hiba, the bell I talked to you about, my wife recently got a message from her who knows her. And she said, I'm now, after 40 years, planning to go back to my home.
Yeah. Moazzam, off camera, we had a conversation about just the feeling of jubilation that exists within the Syrian communities around the world. And, you've, through your role in Cage and also family connections, you've got lots of connections with Syrians. I mean, tell me a little bit about the feeling you're getting from Syrians who've been dispersed around the world.
Indeed, I have Syrians in my family. One of my sons is married to a Syrian. I've lived there and I'm still maintaining those connections. Sure. I spoke to a brother who was working for Médecins Sans Frontières. Yeah. And I lived with him very closely, and I called him and said, how are things there? How are you feeling now this has happened? Are you safe? And so forth. He said he was so happy, ecstatic. He said, for the first time, us as internally displaced refugees or persons, we are able to go back home, and we're all going home. Wow. Now, this idea of you're all okay in Syria, and if you had to leave your home for 8 years or 10 years or 50 years, it's a price worth paying. It's completely taking away from the Syrian experience because it doesn't play into the narrative that some people want to push.
Well, Ben, can I talk about that narrative? Because I was going to ask you about this later, but I think it's probably apt to do that now. There is a impression we get from some sources on the internet that, in particular from the left and some parts of the left, that argue that this is the wrong time, and Assad is a positive figure, and this is all part of a major plan. And somehow that Syrians should bear that pain, if they even believe there is pain, but should bear that pain for the sake of some greater good. I mean, how would you address this? In particular, I want you to talk about, because you have, through Cage, you've had lots of conversations with, naturally because of the work you do, you've had conversations with people from the left. A lot of them have just been horrendous on this issue.
So let's just look at this now for context, right? It's really important. We, as Muslims, as people who believe in justice, who believe in holding power to justice, the powerful to justice, we look at the suffering of the Palestinians and we rightly act in whatever way we can and do whatever we can and hold our voices, even if it comes at some risk to ourselves.
Yes.
But we did that for Syria right through the revolution. Yeah. Many people may know that the British government attempted to lock me away for 15 years because I was in Syria investigating the role of the CIA and MI5 and so forth, and attempting at least to send a generator to one of the brothers who needed their electricity, and they tried to deem that as terrorism. And this is the most important part, because from 2014, at least, if it wasn't even before that, it was the Muslim community, all of us, for supporting Syria being criminalized. Yeah. And that became the major player of the Islamophobic and structural racism that came upon us from the state in the form of that Islamophobia, meaning we're passing law after law, including Prevent, which came off the back of the Syrian conflict.
Yes.
And there were hundreds of Muslims that went from here to help. I know several doctors, I know 2 who were killed trying to help in the refugee camps. Yes, of course, some people joined ISIS and so forth, and with that stick, we were all beaten. But in relation to the left and their vision of us, one thing that has been forgotten totally, if 43,000 Palestinians have been killed right now, then that is something we cannot stand for. But then what will you say when 610,000 Syrians have been killed?
Yeah.
Why is that number simply just a statistic that you're not even prepared to look at? It means that you have dehumanized the Syrians to the level of which you would not do that to anybody else. And the Syrians, most of the Syrians you'll find from the opposition, they all support Palestine. They all support Gaza. They all support the resistance there. You won't find anybody coming along, except unless they're twisted, that they will come along and say that we don't care what's happening to the Palestinians. I simply have not come across that from any of the rebels.
Yeah. So can I ask you why? Why are they so blinkered in a way? You know, they support Palestine, and you know the impression we've got over the last 13, 14 months is one of just positive allyship. These people are supporting a just cause. But on Syria, they're willing to forsake humanity and justice. Like, what's going on there conceptually in their universe that allows them to dismiss Syrians and their struggle and yet embrace another struggle for justice?
You know, obviously there's this presentation that Syria somehow is this great bulwark of defense of anti-imperialism and standing against oppression and so forth. But, you know, it's a simple question. During the entire period of the War on Terror years, how many pro-Assad supporters were getting arrested by the British security services? Sure. How many of them were getting detained at airports? How many of them were getting questioned under Schedule 7? How many of them were having their bank accounts closed? It was happening to all of us, including me, all of us. So you can see on the one hand that you're free as an anti-imperialist to do whatever you want. You can talk all about your anti-imperialism without being targeted. And why is that? Yeah. Why is the state not coming after you? Why are they coming after me? Why are they coming after the Muslims? And so you have to ask yourself, in the same way, Assad, why is the West isn't going after Assad? Even when they bombed Assad, there was one occasion when the Americans bombed Assad, and I think 3 or 4 people were killed out of the 50 cruise missile strikes. I was in Afghanistan when the Americans fired cruise missiles. They killed thousands of people. So that was a coordinated strike with the Russians. And if you look at it, when they were bombing in Syria, it was, I think since World War II, it's the first time that the Russians, the French, the British, and others coordinated their strikes. They would argue to say that this is just ISIS, but it wasn't. They were targeting the other rebel groups because the thing that was in common, that the West, Assad, Russia, were saying that these are all Al-Qaeda, these are all terrorists. And using the language of terrorism, it's our experience is once you've done that, you've delegitimized and dehumanized those Muslims. And it's unfortunate that Iran would step into that because they get called terrorists all the time. Yeah. And they should actually become a little more politically wise, that you start calling people terrorists. You're already called terrorists. So stop with that language and try to find another way rather than targeting people there.
So Moazzam, let me ask you then about Russia, because many of the anti-imperialist left, they see American imperialism as bad, but they see Russians' imperialism, and they wouldn't call it imperialism, as something that's benign or positive in the world. They see Russia as a bulwark against America's hegemony. And so in a way, it's positive and it needs to be supported. And actually, China as well. We can come to that, actually, because their position on the Uyghurs, call it the Uyghur hoax. And you hear that all the time from some of these guys on the net. I suppose my question, Ben, is about Russia. Like, how should we, because you find a lot of Muslims support Russia. And whenever you speak ill of Russia, and I noticed that recently over Syria, where I started to question quite publicly Russia's actions in Syria and how it thwarted the revolution. And there was a lot of pushback from Muslims who otherwise are very sincere, who suggest that Russia is somehow a cause that should be celebrated in the world. Like, how do you view Russia?
I think let's just do this, right? Let's play a little experiment. We'll take an image of a child underneath rubble.
Yeah.
We'll manage to see part of his hand sticking out, and his mother screaming, and his father desperately trying to pick up the concrete block that's fallen on his head. He pulls him out, but only half his body comes out.
Yeah.
Now, let's say this isn't Palestine, it's Syria. Because that's what was going on for the past, from 2015 until recently, with the Russians bombing right through Aleppo and beyond and nobody cared. And that was happening, and I'm telling you, even now, the Russians have bombed, and they've wiped out several entire families. And if you were just to the uninitiated, those who don't know, and say, if you say this was a Palestinian family, you'd find a huge amount of support from the very people who, if this was a Syrian family, would go into denial. And that's essentially what's been going on here. The dehumanization. There's an active dehumanization. And if your heart breaks for seeing what happens to the Palestinians, your heart should equally break for what you see happening there, unless you have an entirely different agenda. And if that is the case, then even your support for the Palestinians is questionable. Because what if tomorrow, let's just say, and this is a fact, what if tomorrow, after all, the resistance in Gaza is very Islamic? If tomorrow they turn around and say that we are an Islamic resistance, as some of the leaders already said, like Dalal Nasser from the Islamic resistance, he said that the Syrian resistance is equal to the Palestinian, that a Syrian child and a Lebanese child and a Palestinian child are all equal in their worth in the sight of this ummah. And they have quoted the Quran and the Sunnah and said that the only way that we revive our deen is through this. Are they really, as the left or whoever they are, really going to embrace this? The answer is no.
Yeah. Can I move on to the opposition? Because the narrative in, I think, similar circles is that the opposition are all ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Now, you've worked with the opposition in collecting information and research for Cage. So you've got some understanding of the opposition. Like, explain who they are, and in particular HTS and their affiliations and where they stand on this sort of spectrum of understanding. Yeah.
So in the Syrian revolution, there have been a multitude of different groups, and it's fair to say that it started with officers from the military who set up the Free Syrian Army.
Yeah.
Because of the targeting, because of the sectarian nature that was imposed upon them, and that when they responded to peaceful protests during the Arab Spring, there was a deeply brutal massacre that took place of protesters. I've met so many of them who were shot, paralyzed. I used to speak to one man who was actually paralyzed as a result of what happened to him being shot by Syrian soldiers. Women taken into custody, raped, the infamous case of Hamza al-Khatib, the young boy who was tortured to death, who was just 13 years old. So there's so much of this going on. The opposition, essentially, this was the Free Syrian Army. Then you had a group like Ahrar al-Sham, Harkat al-Ahrar al-Sham al-Islami, which was led by Hassan Aboud, these are all people who are former prisoners, but they had a vision for Islam. And if you especially look at Ahrar al-Sham, what's happening now with HTS is exactly what they wanted back that time. But Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Nusra Front, saw them as a little bit too moderate. Now, the Nusra Front, which is essentially, this has gone through several transformations. it was Al-Qaeda in Syria. That's essentially what it was, right?
Yeah.
And it originated from Iraq and its connection to the original anti-ISIS, anti-US ISIS, or Islamic State in Iraq, rather, in Iraq.
Yeah.
So that went through a transformation. They separated, and Jolani set up his own group, Jabhat al-Nusra, and then it eventually, they started to change and they amalgamated with other groups, including Ahrar al-Sham, and set up...
HTS.
no, before that, it was... I forget the name now. But nonetheless, they formed together a group with the aim of being united. And then there was the last transformation, which was HTS, Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham.
Right.
So the group was called Jabhat Fath al-Sham. So that transformed. And it started to change its views. There was a purge. They arrested several people, including people we know, including all sorts from across the board, not just those who were quote-unquote pro-Al-Qaeda. And there was arrests, there was people mistreated and so forth. That did happen, we know that for sure. But there definitely has been a transformation, an attempt to placate, allay the fears of minorities, of the West and beyond, to say that we are not here to target anyone outside our borders. And essentially, this is a struggle for the Syrian people, an Islamic struggle, but for the Syrian people inside. And that's the language that Jolani has been passing through. And that is, from my understanding, what has been happening on the streets. People are sick to death of living under a torturous regime where you can't raise your head, where every second person around you could be spying upon you. And that's the old, style of the Assad regime. And it's past its sell-by date. It by necessity now. I don't think anybody on the streets wants the old anymore, whether they are pro HTS or pro Free Syrian Army or the Syrian National Army, which is the other part of this rebel group.
Yes.
The Syrian National Army, which is kind of more pro-Turkish or controlled, or areas that are controlled by the Turks, they're also pushing forward. And eventually, I think the speed with which this is happening, it's just a question of time before Assad falls.
Inshallah, I've just got a quick notification here that the rebellion is now 5 kilometers away from Damascus. Alhamdulillah, it's proceeding very fast. So Moazzam, I just want to pick up on that point you mentioned there about ISIS, because we still get this, that the Syrian opposition are all ISIS. Like, what differentiates this current opposition and ISIS as a group? Can you spell that out for us, please?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think anybody who makes the ISIS accusation against the rebels or the opposition is that, do you know the relationship between ISIS and the opposition?
Yeah.
Do you know that just as we're hearing now that the rebels are approaching Damascus, that they were approaching Damascus in 2014, and that in fact areas near Damascus like Yarmouk and so forth had been obliterated, which was full of Palestinians by the Assad regime. So those who think that the Assad regime is defending Palestinians, not at all. And so it was the rise of ISIS in the midst of the revolution and the rebels that literally stabbed them in the back.
Right.
Despite the various, it's true that there were many different groups, but they had come to a point at which, in a unified way, they were encroaching upon the regions that were, Damascus was in their sights.
Yeah.
And then ISIS came and declared its so-called caliphate. If you're not with us, you're against us. And I know people personally who were captured by them and executed, beheaded.
Right.
There was a man that we used to live with their family. My wife was working in the hospital and looked after by his wife. I used to look after his kids when he'd be gone. And his name was Abu Suleiman. And ISIS took him into custody. He was a very active person. People knew him, and they asked him to give bay'ah or allegiance to them. He refused, After 6 months of imprisonment, they beheaded him.
Brilliant.
And still, we were trying to assist his kids, Fatima and Zainab and Ruqayya and so forth. And that's just one example of hundreds of people from the opposition that they were beheading. They actually killed one of the rendition victims that I went to go and meet, who'd been handed over by the CIA to the Assad regime and imprisoned. So people need to understand the relationship between ISIS and the different groups, the Islamic groups in particular, the rebel groups. So they killed more of those people ever than they did anyone else.
Yeah.
So the allegation that they are all ISIS is nonsensical. It makes no sense. Even if, let's just say, Jolani came out of the original Iraqi Islamic State, they separated. And then they changed and rebranded and disconnected from Al-Qaeda Central. So they're neither ISIS nor Al-Qaeda. It's just a fact. It's a stated fact, even if you dislike them. Right. So to say, to delegitimize the opposition, all of them, which includes Free Syrian Army, who are far more secular in their outlook, and to with one swoop of the brush to say that they're all ISIS, quote, or stroke Al-Qaeda, you're saying that because you know it's not true. Yeah. And you know it's not true because you want to be able to say that they have no legitimacy there and that they should all be for, because Assad is the better option. And that's simply not true, because why are ordinary people in the streets celebrating? Are we suggesting that ordinary people on the streets celebrating in this way, they're also ISIS too? And this is exactly what Israel does in Gaza. It's exactly the same thing. When their politicians say again and again, it's all of them. They are all responsible. They've all got tunnels under their homes. They all facilitate Hamas. They voted for them. So that's exactly the same thing that those who are saying the rebels are ISIS, it's what Israel does.
And Moazzam, you've used the word Islamic groups and an Islamic future and Islamic policies and quite a lot there. And a lot of my viewership are non-Muslims, and they will see that and they will get the impression that this is an exclusionary state, a state that is exclusive to Muslims only. And so the question then comes, Syria is a diverse society. You've got Druze and Christians, you've got Alawites. Is there a danger that a post-Assad, inshallah, post-Assad Syria is going to be one that will threaten minorities, whether Muslim minorities or other minorities?
Well, let's just look at what's happened since the Assad regime.
Yeah.
So you've got a minority of Alawites who are in power.
Yeah.
And they have imposed through iron and steel massacres like the Hammam massacre and many others. As I said, Hibat Dabagh talks about how Christians and Druze and Alawites were taken into custody and tortured beyond recognition. So we know you already have a torturous regime there. Yeah. So the question is, are they going to be worse than Assad? Are they going to be worse than those who butchered over 600,000 people? That's the real question.
Yeah.
And from what we've heard from Jolani and his acolytes is that they've spoken to and tried to allay the fears. It's possible. It's possible that people start to get mistreated. That's not beyond the realm of possibility, especially in the fervor of rebellion. But this is what's being put out, and you can only take what's being said, and that is that the Christians, the Druze, the Alawites, and any other minorities have been told that you are safe, you will be protected, you can continue your life as normal. And we've seen some videos come out of rebels talking with and standing with Christian ladies and welcoming them and thanking them. There's a friend of mine who's there, Toxus Sharif, who's standing next to a Christmas tree with some of the Christian friends he has over there. So I don't think so. It's not within the Islamic belief system to harm or mistreat people of another religion. It's just not our belief system. Yeah. And if people did that in the past, it's because they didn't follow what Islam says about the treatment of minorities.
In a sense, do you think that, because of course, Jolani and HTS and the other groups that had administered Idlib, they had to deal with the daily routine or daily life of minorities within Idlib. So do you think, in a sense, I mean, of course, this revolution has taken 13 years to get to mature, inshallah, to something. But do you think that small stint as administrators or governance in Idlib has actually helped them mature and develop, broader policies that will place them in good stead for, inshallah, some form of governance structure in Syria as a whole?
Well, they have to be, because they have to deal with so many disparate and different types of ideologies and groups and belief systems. And, for example, the region of the Syrian National Army, they will have to deal with them. They're not HTS.
Yeah.
And they are a force, they're a military force as much as they are Syrians. So they will have to deal with them. And to what I've heard also is that there are groups of Druze and others who've actually joined the revolution. Even the Kurds have fought now against Assad. So all of them are coming together. The question will be, how will they manage it? That will be the litmus test. But if you just take a look in Gaza, for example, an Islamic group that rules that area, it isn't the Islamic group that's targeting and bombing the churches, third century churches and monasteries and so forth. It's the Israelis doing that. And if you ask the Christians from the Palestinians, what do they say about their oppressor? It's very clear. Their oppressor isn't the Muslims. Their oppressor is the Zionist. And in the same way, I think that you'll find that if voices are allowed to come out of Syria, that they will say that our oppressor has been the Assad regime for all of these decades.
Can I ask you a question about Assad? The criticism of the opposition is that Assad was someone that the West wanted to get rid of, partly because or completely because Assad was this opposition against Israel, and Assad played a central role in this fight against Israel. And so it's all part of his plan. And I suppose the insinuation there is that the Americans are either turning a blind eye or even promoting this in order to undermine a pro-Palestinian country or faction. Like, do you find anything within that criticism that makes sense to you?
Just think about it. The last time that Syria under the Assads fought against Israel, the key imperialist Zionist entity in that region, was in 1973. It's like 52 odd years ago. That's the last time they fought. And whilst it's true they fought before that, after that, and especially after the Golan Heights were taken, to this day, the majority of the Golan Heights are occupied. Several years after the war in 73, Israel annexed the whole place. It is now Israeli territory. And they'd even got a brigade called the Golani Brigade, which is fighting in Gaza and taking a bit of a kicking from what I've understood. But they have totally occupied it. So the question is this, that if your country borders this place that you're supposed to be this great anti-imperialist against. What have you ever done for 50 years to take, let alone to defend or to help or to arm the resistance in Gaza, or to fight or to send your troops there or your aircraft to defend them? What have you done to take on back your own land? And when Israel bombs you, which it has been doing even now as we speak, what retaliatory action do you do as this great anti-imperialist defender?
You bomb Idlib instead.
You bomb your own people.
Yeah.
The people that you're supposed to be looking after and taking care of, you're actually bombing them and saying it's them is the problem, not the people that are actually bombing you. So that tells you all you need to know about this so-called presence of Syria being this place that the West don't want.
Also, let me ask you about the resistance, the Palestinian resistance, and their relationship with Assad, and also their relationship with the Syrian resistance. Because, of course, the impression we get is that the Palestinian resistance is very much pro-Assad, and that is the one singular narrative that comes through from this anti-imperialist left and from Iran and others. Like, explain that relationship to me, please.
So first of all, let's look at this. Ideologically, they come from the same place. They both essentially come from the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're targeted in Hama in the 80s, and still the revolution, it starts off, at least to some extent, with those influences in 2011 and 12. In Palestine, and particularly in Gaza, it's still in Harakat al-Muqawamah al-Islamiyya is the Muslim Brotherhood, and essentially. So they are ideological brothers. They're from the same movement. So it is natural for them to support one another. And so when the Syrian revolution begins, you have the leaders of the Palestinian resistance like Haniya and others photographed with images of the Free Syrian flag and so forth. And they are presenting this as something, they call them the brave Syrian people rising up for their rights. Now, as a result of that, they have to relocate because Hamas has a presence in Syria.
Yeah.
But even now, if you look at, for example, the statements by Talal Nasser, who is one of the spokespeople, he makes it very, very clear that this is something that we're deeply proud of and happy about. We don't separate one from the other. There are statements by people like Sinwar before he passed away, before he was killed, in which he talks about the Assad, or talks about Syria in itself. But it's understood. Unfortunately, the Palestinians have been abandoned by the Sunni world.
Yes.
They have been abandoned by their neighbors.
Yeah.
And that's primarily because these governments are run by despots, tyrants, who, like we've said before, were implementing the US torture program in all of their lands, Jordan and Egypt and even Syria, to be honest with you. They were all doing it. But at least there was some respite they had. We've already explained how Syria didn't do anything to defend itself against Israel, let alone anyone else. And the only place you can see that somebody's actually taken up the armed struggle to fight is in Lebanon. And whatever your view of what's happened to Hezbollah or not, you can't take that away from them. You just cannot.
Yeah.
And so, but the relationship, it's natural. There are so many videos I've seen coming out from ordinary people of Palestine. When we see your freedom, when we see you coming back to your homes, when we see you exercise the right to return to your home, we think about us going back to our homes. And it's natural for them. So I think that connection is only going to build. And people who say that as a result of what's happened in Syria, Palestine is being forgotten, Palestine will never be forgotten.
Moazzam, I feel that a lot of us have developed our political knowledge and our political advocacy and a political activism upon these very shaky and fragile anti-imperialist standards that we get from commentators on the net. And I just wonder whether we need to recalibrate that and build it upon more solid foundations. And for you and I, it's Islam, right? Like, what is it within Islam what are the Islamic concepts that should guide our activism moving forward?
These are the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and the verses of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنَّ هَذِي أُمَّتُكُمْ أُمَّةٌ وَاحِدَةٌ وَأَنَا رَبُّكُمْ فَاتَّقُونَ. He says the same verse again, but this time with وَأَنَا رَبُّكُمْ فَاعْبُدُونَ. So he connects the concept of being united with taqwa, with fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the second concept of being connected to the concept of ibadah, of worship. So our unity is an act of worship. Allah says, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. Hold on to the rope of Allah, be not disunited. He's explained how the Muslims are the brothers of Muslims, and one part of the body feels pain. It is the rest of the part of the body that feels it. We feel it in Palestine, we feel it in Syria. It connects us, and it keeps us as one brotherhood. It doesn't mean that anybody that's outside of that brotherhood is abandoned or put aside. It's just this extra connection, which is a Rabbani connection. It's a divine connection that follows us into the hereafter. What we do for our brothers in this dunya will see its fruits in the hereafter.
Yeah.
And when we try to help people, even who are not from our ummah, they're not from Islam, but we come to their assistance when they're facing an injustice, even if it's from us. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, help your brother whether he's an oppressor or oppressed. And the companion said, Ya Rasulullah, we understand helping him when he's oppressed. That makes complete sense. How do you help him when he's an oppressor? And he said, by staying his hand, taking control of him and trying to stop his oppression. And that is a part of our brotherhood with Islam, with our brothers. It's part of what we love for our brothers, what we love for ourselves. We don't want to see them doing any injustice to anyone, but neither can we allow injustice being tolerated upon ourselves or anyone else.
Yeah.
So this is part of our connection to the Ummah, to whoever they happen to be, and our Islamic framework connects us in this way.
My final question for you is that, are we going to be able to say without consequence, let's go and visit Syria?
Well, what happened to me last time I went there? Look, Syria now has become a living part of our reality. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا فَسَدَ أَهْلَ الشَّامِ فَلَا خَيْرَ فِيكُمْ. If the people of Sham, and Sham is not just Syria, it's Palestine, it's Lebanon, it's Jordan, it's even a bit of Turkey. If the people of this region become corrupted, there's no good in you. And who is he talking to? He's talking to people like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and Umar al-Khattab. Like, there's no good in you if those people get corrupted.
Yeah.
So it's part of our faith to be wanted to connect to this place. Allah used to say to the Prophet ﷺ, Allahumma barik lana fi shamina, Allahumma barik lana fi yamanina. Oh Allah, place blessing in our land of Sham, place blessing in our land of Yemen. So this is a blessed land. And we should feel connected to want to go and visit all these lands and have, it's the land of the prophets. It's the land where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he says, وَالتِّينِ وَالزَّيْتُونِ, he's talking about this land. This is the land of the fig tree and the olive tree. So we should want to go there, but not yet.
Moazzam, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time today.
Welcome. Jazakallah khair. Barakallah feek.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels and head over to our website thinkinmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.